It was close to midnight when the billionaire's private jet landed at the international terminal. He wasn't supposed to be there. Normally, he had drivers, security, assistants, people whose entire job was to make sure he never set foot in a crowded place like this. But tonight, he wanted something different. He wanted to walk among ordinary travelers, to feel the hum of the world that wasn't gilded in luxury. He carried his own leather bag, tailored suit still crisp despite the hours in the air, and as he stepped into the waiting area of the terminal, he let his eyes wander across rows of tired faces, mothers holding restless children, businessmen scrolling on phones, lovers holding hands. He felt oddly human again. That was when his gaze froze. There, slouched on a cold, uncomfortable plastic chair under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, was a figure he knew better than anyone. His wife. His nurse wife. She wasn't at the hospital working a double shift, as she had sworn earlier. She wasn't charting patients or answering late-night calls. She was here, in the middle of an airport terminal, fast asleep with her head tilted against the glass, strands of hair falling across her cheek. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her shoes untied, and her exhaustion was etched deep into her face. For a moment, his heart stuttered. It didn't make sense. Why here? Why now? Why wasn't she where she promised to be? He felt his throat tighten as he watched her chest rise and fall with every slow breath. Around her, strangers shuffled and stared, some whispering and nudging one another, because everyone could recognize him, the billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers and financial channels. And here he was, standing frozen, staring at a woman who looked like the world had wrung her out and left her collapse. A phone camera clicked somewhere. Another followed. Soon there were half a dozen people watching, recording, waiting to see what he would do. Was he going to explode? Was he going to demand answers? The billionaire's jaw clenched, and his mind spun with questions, with confusion, with something dangerously close to betrayal. But instead of anger, something else surfaced. Slowly, almost reverently, he removed his tailored jacket, worth more than most people's cars, and draped it gently over her shoulders. The murmurs around them hushed instantly. No one expected it. His hands lingered for a second as he tucked the fabric close to her neck, shielding her from the chill of the air conditioning. She stirred slightly, a soft sigh leaving her lips, but she didn't wake. And in that fragile moment, his heart broke and healed all at once. Because even if she wasn't where she said she would be, even if questions burned hotter than the fluorescent lights above, he realized that love wasn't always about understanding everything. Sometimes, it was about protecting the person you cared for, even when the whole world was watching, even when doubt threatened to crush you. The terminal, normally full of chatter, seemed to fall silent. Every eye was on him, every phone frozen mid-recording. Here was a man who could buy anything, command anyone, and yet, in this instant, he was just a husband, draping his jacket over the woman he loved. He bent slightly, lowering himself closer to her ear, his lips parting as if to speak words only she could hear, words no one else in the crowd would ever know. And as he whispered, she shifted again, her brow furrowing, her lips parting in a sleepy murmur that no one could decipher. He straightened, eyes glassy, chest rising with a breath that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken doubts. But the moment was far from over, because when she did open her eyes, when she finally looked up and saw him standing there in front of her, the entire terminal would witness a reaction that no one could have predicted, and that he knew was only the beginning. If you've ever laid next to someone who made you feel completely alone, then maybe this story isn't just mine, it's ours. And if that's true, subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard by those who understand. Her eyelids fluttered open slowly, like someone surfacing from the bottom of a deep, restless ocean. She blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, her gaze blurry, unfocused, until it finally landed on him. For a split second, she didn't seem to recognize the man standing in front of her. The billionaire, her husband, towered above her, his presence impossible to ignore, his tailored suit slightly disheveled from travel, his expression carved with both relief and unspoken questions. Her lips parted, confusion flashing across her face, as if she was caught between a dream and reality. And then realization hit. Her eyes widened, her breath hitched, and her hand instinctively flew to the jacket draped around her shoulders, the unmistakable jacket that belonged to him. The air around them tightened. Phones tilted upward, every screen capturing the moment. 1,000 strangers turned into silent witnesses. Some expected her to jump into his arms, to smile, to embrace him after days apart. Others braced themselves for an argument, for the kind of explosive confrontation only heartbreak could ignite. But instead, what emerged was silence. Her silence. Her fingers clutched the fabric, knuckles pale, as if she were holding on to more than just a piece of clothing. He studied her face, every flicker of panic, every shadow of exhaustion, every hesitation. His mind screamed for answers. Why was she here? Why wasn't she at the hospital like she swore she'd be? Why had she left him wandering in doubt while she hid away in a corner of an airport terminal? But his mouth betrayed none of it. Instead, he crouched at her level, their eyes locked, so close now that the world outside their little bubble felt miles away. "You weren't supposed to see me here," she whispered, voice trembling just enough for him to catch. It was meant to be private, perhaps even a secret. But here they were, center stage, a crowd of strangers holding their breath like an audience awaiting the climax of a play. His jaw tightened, his pulse pounding his temples. But he didn't raise his voice. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he leaned closer, lowering his words so that only she could hear. "Then explain it to me," he said softly, though the steel in his tone betrayed how fragile his patience had become. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room, not the phones or the gawking travelers, but at something or someone he couldn't yet see. That was when he realized this wasn't just about exhaustion. This wasn't about catching her sleeping between flights. There was something more, something deeper, hidden behind her silence. And the way she avoided his gaze told him the truth he feared most. She wasn't ready to tell him, but the truth was already waiting for him to uncover. "I don't care about algorithms. I care about the people listening to this who are bleeding silently like I did. If you've ever held back tears just to protect someone who didn't protect you, subscribe. You don't have to do this alone anymore." As he remained crouched in front of her, his hand resting gently yet firmly on the armrest of the plastic chair she occupied, he noticed her eyes shifting, not toward him, not toward the crowd, but to a point across the terminal. A flicker, brief but sharp, a glance heavy enough to pierce the air. He followed it instinctively, his gaze cutting to the sea of onlookers until it landed on a figure standing several rows back, half hidden behind a column, pretending to scroll through his phone. The man was tall, his posture too stiff to belong to a casual traveler, his eyes darting up just long enough to lock with hers before lowering again. It was subtle, but in that moment the billionaire understood that his wife's exhaustion wasn't the whole story. This wasn't about being overworked. This was about being found. Her breathing grew uneven, shallow gasps barely masked by her effort to stay composed. The billionaire leaned closer, his voice low and steady, but carrying the weight of thunder restrained. "Who is he?" The words were simple, but in their simplicity lay a storm that threatened to erupt. She shook her head quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line, her silence louder than any confession. The crowd was still watching, phones still recording, children peeking curiously over their mothers' shoulders, travelers pretending not to stare but unable to look away. To them, it was drama, gossip unfolding live before their eyes. But to him, it was betrayal breathing life. Her hand trembled as she reached for her bag, fumbling with the zipper, as if she could bury herself in its contents or escape through its seams. He caught her wrist, not harshly, not violently, but firmly enough that she froze. His eyes, dark with disbelief and ache, refused to release hers. "I came here because I couldn't stand one more night wondering where you were," he whispered, his voice cracking at the edges. "And now, you can't even look at me." His words hung between them, heavy, undeniable, while the man near the column shifted uncomfortably, his presence now undeniable. The billionaire straightened slowly, his hand sliding from her wrist as though letting go of her was the heaviest act of his life. He turned his gaze to the shadowed man across the terminal, his jaw tightening, shoulders squared, no longer the exhausted traveler, but the commanding force who had built empires. Yet in this moment, all his power, all his money, All his influence meant nothing. He was simply a man watching a life he thought he knew splinter before him. His wife rose shakily from her seat, the jacket slipping from her shoulders onto the floor like a discarded secret, and the collective gasp of the crowd filled the silence she refused to break. And then her phone buzzed. A single vibration, sharp, loud in the tense quiet. The screen lit up on the chair beside her. He glanced down. A name flashed across the display. It wasn't a patient. It wasn't the hospital. It wasn't an excuse. It was him, the man by the column. And in that instant, the billionaire knew she hadn't just been hiding. She had been living another truth entirely. The billionaire's heart pounded in his chest like the echo of drums in an empty hall. His hands clenched at his sides, not from rage alone, but from the unbearable weight of clarity. The man near the column was no longer a blur in the periphery. He was now the center of the storm. For a fleeting second, the billionaire thought about walking away, about swallowing the humiliation and keeping the facade of dignity. But something deep inside, something primal, something wounded, forced his legs to move. Each step toward the man was slow but deliberate, each one drawing gasps from a curious crowd who had been waiting for this very escalation. His wife reached out, almost stumbling forward, her voice trembling as she called his name, begging him not to make a scene. But her pleas only fed the silence of the terminal, making every word echo louder, painting her guilt for everyone to hear. He didn't stop. He didn't even glance back. His eyes were locked on the man who had been bold enough to stand there, bold enough to look at his wife in secret, bold enough to let his name flash across her phone, as if he had some rightful place in her life. When the billionaire finally stood before him, the air seemed to thin, every sound dulling except the thundering pulse in his ears. The man tried to smile, a weak attempt at composure, but his hands betrayed him, nervously shifting his phone from one palm to the other, avoiding direct contact. The billionaire's voice was low, controlled, the kind of tone that carried more danger than shouting ever could. How long? It was a simple question, yet laced with venom, heavy enough to shatter illusions. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as he darted a glance toward the nurse wife still frozen near her seat. She shook her head almost violently, silent tears streaking her face, silently begging him not to answer. But silence itself was an answer. The billionaire stepped closer, his towering presence overwhelming, and the man instinctively took a step back, bumping into the cold steel of the terminal wall. The crowd's whispers grew louder now, their phones still raised, immortalizing every second of the unraveling drama. The nurse wife finally rushed forward, grabbing her husband's arm, her voice breaking as she tried to explain, words tumbling over each other, excuses half-formed, desperation dripping from every syllable. But the billionaire didn't look at her. He couldn't. His eyes burned into the man's face, searching for even a shred of remorse, of shame, of acknowledgement of the chaos he had ignited. And then, in one swift, almost involuntary motion, the billionaire ripped the buzzing phone from his wife's trembling hand and shoved it into the man's chest. "Answer it," he hissed, his voice a mix of rage and brokenness. "Answer it, and let them all see the truth." The terminal fell into a suffocating silence. The man stood frozen, clutching the phone, his reflection caught in the billionaire's unrelenting eyes. For the first time, his massive calm slipped his breath shallow, his composure fractured. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows or whispers. It stood exposed, trembling in the harsh fluorescent lights of an airport terminal, in front of strangers who had unknowingly become witnesses to the disintegration of a marriage. And as the man's thumb hovered over the screen, the billionaire felt the ground shift beneath him, not for what would be said, but from a realization that his world had already changed forever. If this sounds like your life, stop pretending you're fine. Stop hiding it like I did. Subscribe, not for me, but for every person who thought they were crazy, until the truth finally shattered them. You're safe here. We see you. The silence that wrapped around the terminal was unbearable, a suffocating pause between heartbeats where the world seemed to hold its breath. Dozens of strangers, once weary travelers dragging their suitcases and sipping their late-night coffee, now stood frozen in place, bound together by the magnetic pull of unfolding tragedy. Phones were lifted higher, lenses zooming in, every bystander morphing into both spectator and judge of a story that had bled into their lives without invitation. The billionaire's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, the fury in him only barely restrained by the steel wall of self-control he clung to. His wife clutched his sleeve, her sobs loud now, echoing across the polished floor. Her tears painted her face with streaks of guilt. Yet even as she cried, the words tumbling out her mouth sounded more like desperation than innocence. "It's not what it looks like. Please, you have to believe me." But every plea crumbled beneath the crushing weight of the truth. The hotel receipt, the phone calls, and now, the man standing cornered against the wall. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like fire catching dry grass. "Isn't that his wife?" one voice murmured. "He's a billionaire and she—" Another voice chimed in, cutting off in disbelief. The shame was unbearable. A theater of betrayal playing out for an audience of strangers who would carry this story far beyond the terminal. The billionaire felt their stares, sharp as knives, burning into his back. For a man who had built empires, commanded boardrooms, and silenced critics with a single look, here he was, reduced to nothing more than a wounded husband standing in the ruins of his pride. The man still held the phone, his hand trembling, sweat beading on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent light. He wouldn't answer. He couldn't. His silence screamed louder than any confession. And yet, even in his silence, the crowd seemed to answer for him, their eyes shifting between the three of them, their judgment unspoken but unmistakable. The nurse wife fell to her knees at her husband's feet, clutching his hand, her sobs soaking into his tailored pants. Her voice broke into fragments. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. Please don't do this here." But the billionaire's gaze never left the man. His voice was low, trembling not from weakness, but from the strain of keeping his fury contained. "You humiliated me in my home, in my marriage, and now in front of the world." His words cut through the air like glass shattering, and several in the crowd gasped, some even lowering their phones, realizing they were capturing the crumbling of a man's entire life. The nurse wife gripped harder, her nails digging into his skin, her cries raw, desperate. But for the first time, the billionaire looked down at her, really looked. And what he saw wasn't the woman he had married. It wasn't a partner he had built a life with. It was someone unrecognizable, someone who had chosen secrets and shadows over the trust they once shared. His heart ached, not only with rage, but with the devastating realization that love had already been replaced by betrayal long before this night. The crowd was silent again, leaning in, waiting, holding their breath for the billionaire's next move. Would he explode in fury, lashing out with the force of a broken man? Or would he rise above the wreckage, walking away with nothing but silence and dignity, leaving the guilty to drown in their own shame? Every eye was locked on him, every soul in the terminal caught in the gravity of his choice. And as the weight of decision bore down on his shoulders, the billionaire closed his eyes for the briefest of moments. Preparing for what would come next, you've come this far. That means something. You felt this. You lived it. Maybe not this exact story, but your own version of it. So if you're still here, still breathing under the weight of something they'll never apologize for, hit subscribe, because no one should walk through this kind of betrayal alone. And if no one else says it, I will. I'm glad you're still here.